The Louis Burke Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College has presented free talks for the public by best-selling authors and great thinkers on the college's Upper East Side campus.
Hi, hope you enjoy it.
Those of you who are writers know what I'm talking about. You have a little voice in your head drives you crazy.
We're dancing with words, prancing with words.
As a result of the 2020 coronavirus pandemic and required social distancing, public gatherings such as our remaining 2 talks for the spring semester have unfortunately been canceled.
Thank goodness we've recorded it.
Center Director Louis Frumkes has had each of the talks recorded for archives and to provide a copy of the talk to the speaker on DVD.
We have some incredible scientists coming.
That the universe just began.
Given the need for intellectual stimulation during this troubling time, the Frumkes Center is making many of our past talks available to view for a limited time each week. Stay tuned to our website for more information about the videos available each week.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Louis Frumkes. I'm the director of the Hunter College Writing Center in CE, and I will have the distinct pleasure of introducing David Patrick Columbia today. Did Jennifer just go? She's here? Okay. Hi, Jennifer. This is the president's reception, so all of you who complimented the food, please thank her. I should tell you that this is our second year here, and I hope you read the programs and come to some of our other events. We have a best-selling author series. We have a great Thinkers of Our Time series with all the events mostly coming up front. And we have a few special evenings like tonight. So let me tell you a little about David, although I suspect most of you know him better than I. I can't remember just how long ago I first met David Patrick Columbia, or where. Perhaps it was while he was walking his dogs near my building. We are neighbors, as it turns out. Or at a small dinner party given by a mutual friend, Gerda Vanderbilt Whitney Connor at the River Club. Our writer-in-residence at the center is named for Gerda, who passed away a year ago. However, I remember liking David immediately because he is warm and bright, and only subsequently did I learn how talented he was and that he was a straight shooter with no airs. The result of this meeting led to my running into David everywhere I went from then on. We played in the same playgrounds, apparently. It also led to his generously covering a number of literary events with which I was involved, and even to my inviting David to speak at the Harvard Club, where he charmed the Cantabrigians with his dazzling charisma and professionalism. And that is why he is here this evening. David is both a friend of mine and also a friend of President Rob's. And while everyone knows that David is the ultimate go-to person, if you have any aspirations to become part of the who's who in New York society, since he is the publisher of the powerful New York Social Diary and the editor of Quest magazine, not many people really know much about who David is himself and how he got to be DPC, as insiders tend to refer to him. Men and women alike know that David is a handsome devil with model good looks, but as you will soon discover, there is a formidable intelligence lurking behind that attractive exterior. For all these reasons, it gives me great pleasure to present to you this evening a terrific writer and social chronicler of our times, ne plus ultra, David Patrick Columbia.
I guess this water's not going to... Well, that was... These things make me nervous. Can you hear me? Okay, because I don't hear very well, and I can't actually hear myself a lot of the time. Louis, thank you very much for those flattering remarks about me. I think it was last summer I was walking down East End Avenue to get some groceries from Gristedes, and this guy pulls out of, did you get your seat yet? This guy over here is late. Where's your wife?
She's here. She has her seat.
What? Oh, there she is. Okay. I was walking down East End Avenue one summer afternoon, perfectly happy, and this guy pulls out of Gracie Terrace, I think it's called. The Gracie Terrace? Yeah. And he puts down his window. I don't know who the hell it is, and he says, "Do you want to speak at the Writers' Center at Hunter College in March?" This was like last August. And I said, yes. And I said yes because I'm now a grown-up person, and I know that as a professional person, when you have an opportunity to speak, you should say yes. And actually, I hadn't a clue as to what I would talk about. So I didn't think about it at all until a couple of days ago when he reminded me that I was going to do this. I hope you're okay with me going like this all the time. I'm a child of the 60s, remember this? And actually, I didn't know what I would say to you, but this is a writer's center, so I'm going to talk about how I became a writer, the writer that I am today versus just a writer. And actually, a few years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, there's a website called The Big Think. And they interview people. They interviewed me. And they interview on camera, and they ask you all kinds of questions about your world or the life or whatever it is that you're known for. And I looked it up the other night because I didn't know what I was going to be saying to you. And this is what they wrote about me in The Big Think. This was the introduction they gave about me. David Patrick Columbia is a co-founder, the editor, and the editor of New York Social Diary. Actually, my partner is here right now, so he's the other co-founder. It's a website that chronicles the lives of Big Apple's elite. So, since leaving Colby College in 1962, actually, I flunked out of Colby College in 1962. I don't say that proudly, but I say that honestly. Columbia has led numerous lives. They've had worn many hats, as they say. He's been a stockbroker, an owner of a head shop in upstate New York. Maybe you're not old enough to know what a head shop is, or maybe you're too old to know what a head shop is. A sportswear designer, which is not totally true. I'll get into that later. Which I operated in New York, and a freelancer. And it said he wrote a first-hand account of one of Truman Capote's lost weekends. That's coming up. And a scriptwriter for courtroom television shows. In 1988, Columbia finally found his calling when he collaborated with Debbie Reynolds to write her autobiography. And in 1994, Columbia began writing the New York Social Diary for Quest magazine. It's a condensed version. It now appears at Quest every month. And the New York Social Diary website was launched in September 2000. Columbia has since been something of a social fixture himself. He's been the subject of articles and blog posts in the New York Magazine, Gawker, New York Observer, and the New York Times. And that's sort of it. I thought, well, that kind of sums it up if you don't really know anything about me. And actually, it doesn't really tell you much more about me either. So I thought I'd go into a little bit of my history. I better take my watch off so I see how long it is I'm talking, because I do talk a lot, and you could be falling asleep on me. I'll be your Ambien. I was born in New York City in 1941, in the summer of 1941. My mother and father lived in a small apartment building at 236 East 25th Street, and I know that only because it's still there. And actually, I didn't grow up here because the same year that I was born, my mother and father moved to Massachusetts, where my mother had sisters, had family. And why they moved to Massachusetts at the time, well, I was an infant, so I knew nothing about it, not why, but there was a reason why they moved. But it was kind of strange that they did, because both my mother and father loved New York. My father was a Brooklyn-born Irishman, and my mother was a person who was just romanticized by the whole notion of the city. And I tell you that because actually that's where it came for me. But they moved to Massachusetts, and I was brought up in Massachusetts. I lived there until I went away to college when I went to Colby in Maine. I was a scholarship student, and that's why when I flunked out, I never went back, because I knew I wouldn't have the money to go back. The house that I grew up in When I was 5 years old, I tell you this story only because somehow it seems significant to me about myself and why I'm a writer. But the house that I grew up in, I think we moved in when I was 5 years old, and I can still remember when they drove up to the house. My mother and father had a terrible relationship. They fought all the time. And there were serious issues that caused this fighting. There were other issues that I was too young to know and understand, but one of the issues was my father was a compulsive gambler, and so he never had any money. Everything was always gone, and my mother had to support us, so this caused a lot of problems. And the first few years that we were living up in Massachusetts, when I was a very little boy, I don't have any memories, obviously, of New York City, but I do have memories from the time I was 2 years old in Massachusetts. We moved to, we lived in several houses, and finally, one Sunday, we went out for a ride. You know, in those days, in the 1940s, people went out for rides, or they went out for walks, and there was no television, so we didn't watch television. They found a house in a very nice neighborhood, a very nice, what we now would call a middle-class neighborhood, of houses that were probably built in the late 19th century, early 20th century. And this one particular house, even as a little boy, I realized was not a very nice house. It was a house it was very old. It hadn't been painted. I still can remember as a child that the clapboard was brown and porous, as if it had needed paint for a very long time. And my mother went into the house. My father was in the car, and my mother, when she finally came out and she said something to him, I can't remember, of course, what it was, but she said they were going to take it. So we moved into this house. And it had no electricity. It had been actually the farmhouse in the neighborhood that we were moving into. All the other houses had been built maybe 50 years later, but it had no electricity. It had a little toilet in the cellar. It had a black sink in the kitchen. It had no heat. And I tell you this only because it was very, very primitive, obviously. And at the time, when I was a little child, I realized that it was a difficult place to live. For example, the first 2 or 3 years that we lived there, my father electrified the house. He put the electricity in the house, which was pretty amazing when I think back on it. And the heat, all the heat was in the kitchen. We had a wood stove in the kitchen, and I feel like I'm telling you an Abraham Lincoln story. We had a wood stove in the kitchen, and actually until I was 8 or 9 years old, I was bathed in a galvanized iron tub that my mother heated the water on the stove. And I used to remember when we went to bed at night, they had what they called soapstones that we'd found in the attic of this house. Soapstones were these stones that you could wrap. You put them on the stove and you heated them up, and you wrapped them in towels and you put them in your bed when you went to sleep. And they actually were wonderful because they warmed your feet, and so they warmed the whole thing. I tell you that because, well, when you think of where I am today and what I do today and what I'm all about today, it's a rather strange place to have for this boy, this man who's now a social diarist, so to speak, talking about it. But my mother and father, as I told you, had a terrible relationship from the child's point of view because they fought all the time. And my father, being Irish, also had an Irish temper and made a lot of noise and was capable of tremendous outbursts of violent anger. And I say that with a smile on my face because when that kind of violence is almost so absurd that in retrospect you can only laugh at it. And I realized now, when as a grown-up and many years later after I grew up, I realized what was really going on with him. But so as a result of that, the child, David, avoided the upset of living under these stressful circumstances. They were really not stressful for the boy to live like this, but they were stressful for the adults to live like this. So the result of that, I basically, at a very early age, just I guess because of the way I am, my personality, I had a fantasy life, and the word fantasy now has been ruined in the English language because now it means things that are sexual and everything else. And I had a fantasy life where I created stories. When I played with toys, I created stories like children do, and I basically escaped a lot of the hardship that went on for my mother and father with these stories. And my father loved New York, but never came to New York. My mother loved New York also, and my father, before I was born, or by the time I was born, in his youth, he was a chauffeur. And he drove, and I heard about this because they talk around the kitchen table, and it was the only time, actually, that they were quiet, that there wasn't any problems going on. And naturally, the child, who was always curious, in fact, when I was about 6 years old, they used to call me Scoop, because I always wanted to know what they were talking about, what was going on. They would talk about these people. My father drove for a man named Bouvier. Mr. Bouvier was the father of, we now know, Jacqueline Onassis, but of course at that time that meant nothing to anybody because this was in the late 40s and the early 50s. And he loved Mr. Bouvier. He was called Blackjack Bouvier, and Mr. Bouvier had a Stutz Bearcat, and they would drive at 90 miles an hour out into East Hampton, and they lived in a big house in East Hampton, and they lived in a big apartment in New York. And now this is a little kid who's living in a very simple farmhouse that for a long time had no electricity up in Massachusetts, and I'm hearing about an extraordinary way of life that I couldn't even imagine as a child. And so I was always fascinated by it. My mother brought me to New York when I think I was about 6 years old. That was the first time I came to New York. In those days, you could take an excursion, what they called an excursion train from Springfield, Massachusetts, down to New York. It was a 3-hour ride. You came in the morning and you went back at night. And we did this just so that she could see New York and get her New York fix. Now, I didn't understand at the time that that's what she was doing. I was there for myself. And one of my earliest memories about coming to New York was the first time I came, she took me on a bus ride up Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue, some of you may remember, used to go both ways. She took me on a bus ride up Fifth Avenue. It was a summer day, and it was an open bus, a double-decker, and there were a lot of what I later learned were houses on Fifth Avenue, and there was one particular house that I didn't know was a house. There was one building on Fifth Avenue that was being demolished, and it was basically a pile of red bricks, but it was clearly a very large building. And I said to my mother, "What's that?" And she said, "That was the old Colgate house." Now, it wasn't the old Colgate house. I'm pointing to this guy over here because he's an expert on old houses in New York, and he actually does some work for us from the New York Social Diary, John Foreman. I know it wasn't the old Colgate house, but I was amazed. I had heard of Colgate, obviously, because of the toothpaste. And I found out it was a family, and I was amazed that they lived in a big house, in a huge building, and they called it their house. It was fascinating for me. And so as a result, I always wanted to live in New York. And I always wanted to meet the people who lived in those houses. Anyway, I started writing when I was 11 years old. I asked my mother for a typewriter for Christmas. Now, my mother worked, and she worked behind a counter. She worked carrying trays. She really worked hard labor, and she didn't have a lot of money because she kept the wolves from the door and the roof over her head and a meal on the table. But Smith Corona that year had come out with a portable typewriter. It was about this big. And even at that age, I knew that my mother didn't have a lot of money, but I knew that she was the Santa Claus and she would be the one who'd be providing it for me. And I really wanted to, like kids want toys. And it was a very neat little machine. It was portable. I don't know what it cost. I actually sneaked before Christmas and looked in her closet and saw it. I never told her. Anyway, I started writing stories on that Smith Corona of the kind of things that I played when I played with toys when I was a child. They were always stories about people who lived in houses, and they actually never had the problems in the houses that we had in our house. That was actually my initial experience as a writer, and when I was in high school. I also was an editor of the school paper. I wrote some things for that. I never really considered myself a writer, even though that's really what I like to do. But it was because it was like something I like to do, probably the way kids like to play sports or the kids like to play with toys. That's basically all it was. And I went to college, and I was an editor of the paper there, and I wrote some things there. But I still didn't really consider myself a writer. I was an okay student in the liberal arts when I was a terrible student in the sciences. I flunked all my sciences for 2.5 semesters, which is why I flunked out. But just before I flunked out of school, a guy who was the head of the hockey team, he came up to me one day on campus and he handed me a pamphlet and he said, there's going to be a playwriting contest and you should enter it. And I remember thinking, how the hell would he even know why would he think I would enter it? But anyway, I was embarrassed that he thought that, so I wrote a play just so that I wouldn't be embarrassed. It was a one-act play and it was a contest, and the play I wrote, which I don't think is necessarily so important, but the play I wrote was called 12 Picassos and a Green Rug. And it was about 2 college roommates who, as college kids did in those days, talked about what it was going to be like when you went out into the great big world, when you were no longer sheltered. And one of the roommates said, I am going to do this and this and this, and I'm going to get a job here and here and here, and I'm going to go there and there and there, and I'm going to have this and this and this. It was all boom, 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 boom. And the other guy said, I'm going to have 12 Picassos and a green rug, and I'm not going to do anything. I actually was inspired. It sounds strange, I know, but I was inspired. That was the age of the beginnings of Edward Albee. And Edward Albee was writing one-act plays. And these one-act plays were slightly, according to the way things used to be in playwriting, they were slightly absurd, and that actually inspired me. Well, anyway, we wrote these plays, and they picked out 3 plays that would be performed, and the person who wrote it had to cast the play and produce the play. And I won the contest, and it came as a great shock to me, and it was actually the first experience I ever had in my life of winning. I wasn't an athlete, so I never had the experience of playing in sports and the fun and the elation of winning. It was the only time I ever had that, and I was really overwhelmed when I won. This happened actually the month after I was officially flunked out of school, although I was still at school. And of course, it was very interesting to the faculty and the administration that this kid who flunked out had won the playwriting contest. And they decided from this particular production that I put on that this was a boy who hated his father and had no use for his mother. And actually, when my mother read the play, she said, you know, this isn't very nice. I didn't hate my father, and I didn't have no use for my mother, but perhaps on another level of consciousness I did, and that's what came out in the play. Anyway, the prize for this contest was $100. And in 1962, $100 was actually a lot of money. I don't know, it'd probably be like $1,000 today. So for a kid who had no job and who just flunked out of college, and to get $100, this was extraordinary. And I decided, and this is the way my head has always worked. I was like that kid in the play. I decided I was going to take the $100 and move to New York and start a life. Don't ask me what kind of life it was going to be, because I really wasn't that far advanced. And a friend of mine said to me, a friend of mine in college said to me, well, where are you going to live when you go to New York? And I said, well, I don't know, but I've got this money and I'll rent an apartment. Actually, in those days, you could, with $100, rent an apartment. Not a great apartment, but a nice apartment. She said, well, my mother has an apartment in New York and she hardly ever uses it. Maybe you could stay there. And so I thought, well, that's nice. You know, when you're 20 years old, you can do anything. So she said, I'll ask my mother. She asked her mother. Her mother said, fine. So I went, I packed all my bags. My father came and picked me up at college. They took everything back to Massachusetts. And then after everything was unpacked, I packed it up again, the things I was going to take. And I came to New York to stay in this apartment. And the apartment was on, the address of the apartment was 71 East 71st Street, which is actually the side entrance to 740 Park Avenue. And actually it was a 16-room duplex apartment with a cook and a maid. A German cook, and she was very intimidating. And a little Irish maid she was very nice. And every morning when I got up, there would be a breakfast tray for me in the library with eggs and bacon and orange juice and coffee. And I actually never really knew people lived like that. So that was rather impressive. Only the reality was, even though I liked all of these things, I've never been a person to delude myself about my position in any place I am. And so, as a result, even though it was very nice to live so comfortably, and nobody lived in this apartment, her children were away, she had a big house in Maine, she stayed in Maine, and she actually, this was in 1962, actually she, later, in the early 1970s, decided since she never used the apartment, she wanted to sell it. And so she put it on the market. It was on the market for about 3 years, and she finally sold it for $250,000 and went to Maine. The thing that's interesting to me in retrospect of that particular apartment is even though it was very, very grand and there was all this other stuff, I, of course, never felt it was mine, but I was the only one there, so I've sort of made myself at home. It wasn't mine, and I really wanted to have, as a 20-year-old, I really wanted to have my own place. And I finally moved in with a roommate from college who had a small apartment on East 87th Street, where I lived. When I didn't write at all then. I don't think I read at all either. I just was in New York, and New York, to this boy in 1962, was an enormous exciting experience because I remember thinking I lived on 87th Street between Lexington and 3rd, and I remember I'd walk down Lexington Avenue and look at all the tall buildings, and I saw them all as a great challenge to this boy, what he's going to do with his life. I had several jobs. The first job I got, I lied about the fact that I didn't graduate from college, and I worked in a flour milling company as a sales representative. Don't ask me what that was. I don't really remember what it was, and I finally got out of that, and I got myself a job. Writing. He still wanted to be a writer. He didn't know he wanted to be a writer, but this is what he was gravitating towards. I got myself a job writing for a magazine called Movie TV Secrets. And actually, the cast of characters who worked in this particular magazine, it was down on 150 Fifth Avenue, which in those days, nobody went to Fifth Avenue. There weren't a lot of cars down there or anything else. They'd give you still pictures of movie stars in certain situations, and you'd have to make up a story about the picture. And I remember, for example, I got a picture of Anne Margaret on a motorcycle. And I thought, what am I going to write about Anne Margaret on a motorcycle? So I wrote this silly story about how Anne Margaret loved motorcycles so much that she used to go out and she liked to motorcycle through the mud, and she'd get back to her house and she'd drive into her white rugged living room with this muddy motorcycle. And they printed it. Somehow that idea, the whole idea of that, I also was infused with the idea of becoming an actor. I was also fascinated by Hollywood, and I applied to the neighborhood playhouse, and I went to the neighborhood playhouse for a year. And I discovered when I got out of the neighborhood playhouse, so during that time I also got married. That really wasn't an incidental matter. The marriage lasted almost 10 years, and sometimes we were happy and sometimes we were not. But I found out when I was in the second year I was in summer stock, by this time it was 1967, I realized that I had no talent as an actor. I saw people around me who really were committed and really were dedicated, and even though these are things I wanted, I had the common sense to know that if you can't be committed and you can't be dedicated to something creative, you really just can't do it. And even at that time, I knew that writing was something that I was committed to, but writing for me really was like a therapy. Writing was a way for me to write down things that I couldn't talk about with people, or things that were on my mind that I was too embarrassed to talk about with people. And so I quit the acting business and I became a stockbroker. Now that sounds nuts, I know, but the truth of it is, when I was growing up, I had a rich uncle. He wasn't rich by comparison to New York today, but he was a very wealthy guy, and he read the Wall Street Journal every day. And I, of course, was very impressed that this guy read the Wall Street Journal. I started reading the Wall Street Journal, and I was very impressed with it too. And I got a job through a friend with a stockbroker. And I did that actually for, I think, 4 years, and I was very unsuccessful at it, except I was very interested in the subject, and actually to this moment, I'm still very interested in the subject and rather well versed now, much more than I was then. But I'm telling you all this, it's taking too long to tell you all this. I'm telling you all this because that was my youth. I was in my 20s, and I always felt that I really wasn't going anywhere, and I really wasn't succeeding, and I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, and I was very, very unhappy. It wasn't because I was unhappily married, because sometimes we weren't unhappily married, although we did have a lot of marital issues that came up and went away and came up again. The only memory I had to rescue myself from my depression was the experience I had writing that play in college, and that experience of exhilaration that I had from having, for want of a better word, succeeded, for having achieved something, accomplished something on my own. And so I knew that actually, if I could only return to that feeling or find a way to get there once again, I knew that that would probably be the place for me to go. Even at that time, I still didn't know it would be becoming a writer. But I did decide after that I should train myself to write. Now, when I was in my 20s, I felt like a person who really didn't know anything about life. I had contemporaries who I felt knew a lot about life, but I felt I was very naive and very, well, not ignorant, but really out of it. And so I started writing a journal. And my objective with my journal was to write things that I wouldn't want anybody to see or hear or even know that I thought, only so that I could get myself out of the habit of censoring myself, so that I could write honestly. And I did this for, I think I started in 1970, and I did it for several years. But then what happened in 1970, or 1971, my wife and I, and another couple who are here tonight, who are now old friends of mine, we rented a house together in Stamford, Connecticut. And it was a really nice house, and it was a very good deal. For example, it was a 6-bedroom house. It was from a family it was an IBM executive who was going away for the summer, and they really wanted somebody to take care of the dog. And so for 2 months, we got this house for $1,300, if you can believe it. And it included a club membership. And it was really nice being in Connecticut and out of New York. And this very uneasy, uncertain young man found that it was much more solace there than there was in my life in New York. And one day I was driving with a friend through a little town very close by called Pound Ridge. And there's a section of Pound Ridge called Scott's Corners. And Scott's Corners is almost like it sounds. It's like a little shopping area that's a village. And it's almost rural. And it was very, very charming. And we drove by an old red barn, which was a store. It was a woman's clothing store. And I thought, gee, wouldn't that be fun to have a store? Now, that gives you an idea of the kind of person that I am. I'd say, let's go here, or then let's go there, or let's do this. I had no plan at all. And I was almost 30 years old, and I still really didn't know what I was doing. I was just responding to my tastes and whatever. And I persuaded my wife for the two of us to open the store. And we went to a real estate agent in that town, and she said, well, there's a little red barn down by the side of the road that's going to be available in 2 months. And I thought, well, that's it. That's karma. We're supposed to be here. So we opened what was a head shop. And that was in 1971, and this was the days of the hippies. And this is when people sold drug paraphernalia, and they sold T-shirts, and they sold tie-dyed, and they sold denim. And we thought this would be really fabulous. Well, right next door was Bedford, and the other next door was New Canaan, and the mothers would come in their Mercedes, drive up in their Mercedes in front of the store. The store was an old barn. It was built in 1839. It was a basket factory for the Fulton Fish Market, and raccoons lived in the ceiling, and there were stoves. This was like the house I grew up in. There were stoves in one room, in 2 rooms with pipes that went into the ceiling, and in the wintertime, the raccoons would hang around the pipes, and actually, sometimes their tails would stick down through. So, and customers would come in and say, what's that? And I'd say, it's a raccoon. And oh my God. And sometimes they would relieve themselves too. And so sometimes the people would say, what's that? And I said, it's raccoon pee. And there's actually, there's a woman here in the audience who actually was a customer of mine. But that not when I was selling tie-dyed or drug paraphernalia. My friends, my old friends who are here tonight, the husband of the couple was in the garment business. And after about, I guess it was after about 2 years of total failure, we do like $100 a week gross, and that was our business. My wife and I got divorced, and not because of the failure of our business, although that probably didn't help. And I didn't know what I was going to do, because I had this business that made no money. The store cost $200 a month to rent. And I figured, I don't want to go back to Wall Street. And I was doing my writing, and so I thought, well, I can sleep in the store. And it had a bathroom, didn't have a shower or a tub, but it had a sink. And I thought, I'll just get along with it. And anyway, one day, my friends who we rented this house with in Connecticut, they became aficionados of Connecticut also, and they then had their own house in Connecticut. And I used to lunch and breakfast with them lots of times. And one day, my friend said to me, why don't you sell off-price designer sportswear? And I said, well, what is that? I didn't know what it was. And he explained to me, and maybe you don't know what it is. Actually, off-price designer sportswear is women's clothing like you're wearing right now, but it was then called sportswear at a discount, off-price. And he and his wife became my backers and partners in this business. And this was in October of 1973. And I was actually living out of my car at that time. I was actually doing a lot of house sitting, which was rather convenient, and I was living out of my car. And so he persuaded me that we should try this, and so we loaded up one room of this store with this off-price designer sportswear. And there was one of the first women who came in. The prices were not like the prices when you sold T-shirts and tie-dyed stuff, which a T-shirt would be $3. And I remember a mother came in from New Canaan and said, $3 for a T-shirt? You've got to be kidding me. And she came in and she saw a sweater set for $239, and she bought 3 of them. And I thought, oh my God. I remember standing at the counter thinking, sign the check, sign the check. Anyway, in a very short period of time, this business became rather successful. It didn't become astoundingly successful, but it became, it started doing really rather well. And I decided in December of 1973, I was taking in enough money I could rent a nice little house. And this is before the days of the real estate boom that we've had. So I called a woman who had a signpost with her name on, a real estate person, and I said I wanted to rent a house. She said, her name was Ula Poznansky, and she was Russian. She said, oh, darling, I have the perfect house for you. Now, actually, what happened was I had taken this course called Silva Mind Control. I don't know if everybody's heard of it. It was actually a wonderful course. It was basically a meditation course. And the way you learn to meditate was you had to think of something you really, really wanted, not something that somebody else had that you wanted or somebody who'd be given to you, but something you really wanted, and you had to visualize it. Every time you meditated, you had to visualize this thing. So I had visualized a house that I could have, and naturally, because the guy said, anything you want, you don't have to put any limitations on it. I visualized a house with a view and a lot of windows so to have a lot of sun, and extra bedrooms so I could invite my friends up for the city, and a long driveway, and it was a rather fabulous house. And actually I thought to myself, this is too much. This is like, you got to tone it down a little bit. So I visualized it with a very simple front door. So when I called Ula Poznansky, she said, oh, darling, I have the perfect house for you. And I thought, she doesn't even know me. How would she know I have a perfect house? She took me on a snowy January day down this road in Connecticut, North Stamford, Connecticut, with the stone walls on the side and the snow on the roads. And we came around a curve, and we went up this long driveway, and we came into this driving court. It was a simple clapboard house. And we walked in, and it was the house that I had been visualizing for several months. It had all glass, and it was on 17 acres on a knoll. It was a fabulous house. It was extraordinary. And it was $500 a month, which actually was a lot of money then, but not a lot of money. And I rented it. The significance of that house in my life was I took one of those rooms, and at the suggestion of a friend of mine who knew about my belly aching about not getting what I wanted or going where I wanted to go, et cetera, and knew I wanted to be a writer. He said, why don't you turn one of those rooms into a writing room, and why don't you write there? And I started doing that, and I kept my I kept my journals, etc. But at that time in my before that, I'm really going on about this. I'll try to shorten it. I met a guy named Eric Preminger. Eric Preminger's mother was a very famous woman named Gypsy Rose Lee, and he had just discovered at that time in his life that his real father was a man named Otto Preminger, who was a film director, and Eric was very involved with Otto, and actually I became Otto's stockbroker, and I was exposed to Hollywood, and Eric's mother died in 1970, and my wife and I went to Los Angeles to visit him in the house that he and his wife had inherited from his mother. And she had this wonderful kind of Mediterranean-style house on a hilltop in Beverly Hills. And it was an extraordinary house because it was so not Eastern. It was actually like 1 inch from being a whore's palace, but it wasn't a whore's palace. And she had amazing art. She had Picasso and Miro and Wang Gri. And she actually got all of this art from the artists because Gypsy was so cheap she would never buy anything, but she would get these guys to give her the stuff. And I became, before I went out to Los Angeles, I coincidentally had read Nathaniel West's Day of the Locusts. And I don't know if you've ever read it, but it's a very atmospheric book. And when I got to LA, I was amazed that LA was like the book. And I became totally enamored with Los Angeles. And this was in 1970. And I decided that someday I was going to have to live there. So I had this business, and it was doing well. It was prosperous, and I was living in this house, and I was writing, and my friend Eric also was writing scripts. So I decided I would write a script. And the story I was going to write about was a true story about a family that my father had been a chauffeur for in the 1920s, and there was a scandal in the family, and there was a murder, and there was a trial. And the guy got away with it. He actually killed somebody who was, he killed a young man he had been having a sexual relationship with, and he got off. He had a wife and a family, and he got off. So I wrote the script, and another friend of mine here in New York, a woman named Beth DeWoody, she's pretty well known in art circles here. Her mother was married to a very well-known movie agent and executive named David Beagleman. There was later a big scandal about David Beagleman. But anyway, Gladys Beagleman lived out there. And so after I finished the script, my friend Beth gave it to her mother, and her mother gave it to a woman named Sherry Lansing. But Sherry Lansing at that time was just beginning her career, and Sherry Lansing was actually working for MGM, and her title was Vice President of Creative Affairs, which I've always thought was sort of a wild title for a movie executive. So anyway, Gladys Beagleman gave this script that I wrote to, it took me a long time to write. It took me like 2 years to write this script. Gave it to Sherry, and one night I'm sitting in North Stamford, Connecticut during the week at like 8 o'clock at night, and the telephone rings, and it's Sherry Lansing, whom I'd never met. And she said, "Honey, you are so talented. You should come out here and write scripts." And I thought, yes, that's what I should do. That was in 1977. And at the end of 1978, I sold my business for not very much money because I really wanted to get out of town as fast as I could. And I moved with 5 cats and 1 dog to Los Angeles, where I really struggled for a long, long time. I did a lot of different jobs. I even did temporary typing jobs, and I became even more depressed about my writing career because I didn't have what, I saw what they did in LA. People in LA are very aggressive like people in New York, but in a much different way. They're all smart talkers, and they're all, as one guy I worked for named, I'll tell you about him in a minute, he called them kidders, kidding kidders. I got a job through, again, my friend Mrs. DeWoody, working for a movie producer called Lester Persky. Lester Persky was a rather well-known movie producer at the time. He's no longer with us. He produced one of my favorite films of all time called Shampoo. I got a job with him working as his assistant, and Lester actually lived in New York most of the time, was hardly ever in Los Angeles, and he had this rather nice house in Bel Air, rather large house in Bel Air, no furniture in it, nothing in it but a bed in the bedroom and a couple of chairs in another room, and a card table, which was my desk, and a telephone. And it was a really boring job because he was hardly ever there, and he always had stuff he was working on, but nothing was happening. And so as a result of that, I really had very little to do, and he was rather annoyed that I had very little to do, but he gave me little to do. One day, he said to me, Mr. Truman Capote is coming to Los Angeles, and you are to pick him up at the airport. He talked to me like that. I said, okay. He said, do you know who Truman Capote is? Yes, I do. So I think, well, this will be interesting. It's much more interesting than sitting around at a card table answering a phone that doesn't ring. And so I go to the airport this one day to pick up Truman. And at Los Angeles International, they call it LAX. I'm waiting for, I know the flight. I see people coming off the flight. And you can watch them coming down the corridor towards you to the entrance to the terminal. And there's no Truman. And I didn't know what to think. Everybody came. Everybody was gone. And finally, this little tiny guy shows up way down at the end of the corridor. And he's almost like leaning against the wall. He's got a hat on. He's got that hat. You've seen pictures of him in that hat. He had a hat on, and he's like walking against the wall. It looks like the wall was holding him up. So I know it's Truman, of course, because I recognize him. And I go up to him, and I introduce myself. And I say, my name's David. And I'm here, Lester Persky sent me. And he looks up at me and goes, oh, Lester. Because he talked like that. And it's like, oh, Lester. He was drunk. So I kind of help him to my car. He was totally smashed. He'd just come from New Orleans, where he was just photographed by Harry Benson and 12 of the most beautiful drag queens you have ever seen in your life. And then he had a laugh that went, oh, he had this very deep basso laugh and this really high voice like this. And he was really smashed. I had to drive him to the the Beverly Wilshire Hotel in Beverly Hills. And he was actually very pleasant. He was it was interesting to have this experience with this very famous person because he was trying to impress me with his stories, some of which were not true. I actually knew what the real stories were, but I didn't tell him I knew that. We get to the Beverly Wilshire Hotel, and he's a VIP, so there's somebody waiting at the door for him, and they take us up to his room. And his room was, in those days, the Beverly Wilshire Hotel rooms had names, and this particular floor had names of vineyards on it. There was they're all vineyards. Anyway, he sees the names on the door as we're walking to his room, and he said, "Oh, this must be the alcoholics floor." We get to the room with the assistant manager who wants to impress him, and the first thing he says is, "Where's the Stoli?" Which wasn't there. And then he excuses himself, and he goes into the bathroom. And we're standing outside. The two of us are standing there like, dunces. And you hear, and that's what Truman was doing. And so I left. And that was probably on a Thursday. And when I went back to work on a Monday to Lester's house, it had turned out that weekend, Truman had had a lost weekend, literally. He never, after Friday night, he never left the bed that he occupied in that hotel room. And he never left the bed. So anything he had to do was done on the bed. And actually, it was a lost weekend. That's where he was at, and that's what he did. And I learned about this, of course, because by Monday morning, Lester had tremendous. Lester was not a particularly pleasant person to work for because he was just this side of nasty all the time. But what was interesting to me about him was he was very, very respectful and admiring of writing talent, and he went and got Truman, and he brought him up to the house in Bel Air, and he kind of dried him out, so to speak, and I remember hearing him. He wouldn't let me near him because he didn't want me to know anything, even though obviously I know everything. He dried him out, and he gave him a lecture. It was like a fatherly lecture. You're so talented. You have such a great, great talent. You can't waste your talent by taking drugs and drinking all the time. It was like a fatherly lecture. It was very admirable for him. But anyway, Truman left the next day for New York. I'm telling you the story because at that particular time in my life, I'm working for a guy I really, really don't like. and I really need the job. And my only solace was I'd go home at night and I'd write my journals about whatever. And when this happened with Truman, I wrote it in my journals. A couple of years later, Truman died. Actually, rather suddenly, he died out there. And at that particular time, I was kvetching about my career and my lack of career and my lack of success. And I didn't know what I was going to do about it. I didn't feel like writing a script, but I had all these pages and pages of diaries, of journals. And so I was looking through my journals thinking, maybe I can find a story I can write about and I can sell the story. And so I came upon this entry on Truman. And I sent it to, there was a magazine out there at the time called California Magazine. It was run at that time by a very distinguished magazine editor named Harold Hayes, who had been responsible for the great success of Esquire in the early 60s in New York. And so I sent Harold Hayes, I didn't know him, but I sent him my journal entry about Truman's Lost Weekend. And the next day, I got a telephone call from him telling me how much he liked it, and he'd sent it around to everybody in the office, all the editors, and he had asked them to write comments on it, and they wrote their comments on it, and he said, would you like to see them? And I said, sure. And so he sent me, he said, would you like to write an article on Truman and that particular experience? And I said, yeah, of course. I had never published anything ever. So I said yes, and he sent me the notes from the editors, and the editors' notes were all extremely flattering. I mean, they were just so flattering, I'm not even going to tell you what they were because it sounds like I'm bragging. It was just extraordinary. And so then I agreed to write this article. It took me probably 30 minutes to write the journal entry about Truman Capote, and the article that I had to write about him, it took me 3 weeks, and I just couldn't do it. I didn't know how to do it. And finally I sent it in and then I never heard from Harold Hayes. And finally I called him up 2 weeks later, and he said, yeah, actually it doesn't work. And I said, oh, okay, that's that. And dejected once again. He said, but I do have some comments about it. If you'd like it, I'll send you the comments. And I said, okay. So he sent me, this is still impresses me to this day, a magazine editor sent me 2 handwritten pages on both sides of the page, yellow paper and pencil, of critiques of this particular article. And he went right down the list of what needed to be done, what wasn't done. And I'd already been rejected, so that was that. But to get myself out of the rejection, I thought, well, I'll see if I can do what he's talking about, just to see what that is, so maybe in the future I can do something. And I did. I rewrote the article according to his direction, and I sent it in. And he called me the next day, and he said, you know, this has never happened to me before as an editor where I've done this and somebody's come back and given back the way I wanted it. And he said, and he bought it. And that was my first experience selling something. Now, I went for a long time after that, or what seemed like a long time at the time, and I got a job working in LA, writers hire writers to write for them. And I got a job writing a television movie for a woman who had sold the idea. She was known as a writer. She was a member of the Writers Guild, but she really didn't write that much. And she hired me to write the script for her. I had to have these meetings with her. We'd talk about the script. I'd go home and write the script. And she had 2 weeks to write the script because they'd paid her $35,000 a year before, and she hadn't done the script. I wrote the script in 2 weeks. They liked the script, and they took it. She was so impressed, she'd asked me if I would help her write a chapter and outline for a book that would be a memoir of Priscilla Presley. It's called Elvis and Me. And this actually, I was a big Elvis fan when I was a kid growing up, and this actually was a very interesting piece because this was about what life was really like with Elvis. Life was really not. Elvis was a nice man, but Elvis was a very screwed up person. And Elvis had ate meatloaf and mashed potatoes every single night of his life, no matter where he was. And that's the truth. So I wrote this chapter, an outline for Elvis and Me for the sum of $500. She was getting a $100,000 advance. She paid me $250 of it. And so I said, yeah, I need the other $250, and she didn't want to pay me. And her agent, who was a very powerful and important and well-known agent, still is in Hollywood, called me up to give me hell for asking for the other $250. And I said, but you told me you were going to give me $500. He said, I don't care. Don't ever call me again. He had called me. I said, okay. So this is also very depressing for this would-be, wannabe writer. Then I got a job working on a courtroom TV show. And at that time, actually, the man who was the editor of the Elvis book was a man named Ellis Amber, and he was a very well-known editor here in New York. And he came to Hollywood, and he was at a dinner one night in California that I was invited to at the home of this woman named Edie Getz. And Edie Getz was a very well-known Hollywood character. She was the daughter of Louis B. Mayer, and she was really the queen of Hollywood, and she had everybody who came to her house. I was introduced to her through a friend of mine. She was a much older woman. At the time, I was a good guest because I was a young, nice-looking man, and I could converse with people, and so I was invited, and I was always happy to be invited because the people who would come there would be like Fred Astaire and Cary Grant and all these people, these amazing people. And one night, Ellis Amber, and the editor of Elvis and Me, came to dinner there, and so I met him, and we had a good time. And what I did then, I had how should I say it? I exploited the relationship with him. He went back to New York, and I used to write him letters from Los Angeles about Hollywood and what it was like and the gossip and things like that. I don't write that stuff anymore, actually. I would be killed if I wrote what I used to write in those letters because it was all hearsay and it was really dishy stuff. And so I developed a relationship with him. I eventually told him how she didn't really write that I had written it, et cetera, and he figured that out, and actually he ended up writing it himself. But one day he called me up on the telephone. He said, David, I'm leaving my job. I'm going to the other side of the desk. And I said, what does that mean? He said, I'm going to become a writer, and I'm going to write an autobiography for Kim Novak. And I said, well, that's nice. And he said, yes. He said, I could have written an autobiography for Debbie Reynolds, but Kim and Debbie had a bidding war, and Kim won. I said, oh, that's nice. And he said, you could write that book for Debbie Reynolds. And I said, really? And he said, yeah. He said, I'm going to call the editor right now and tell her about you. So he did, and he called me back 10 minutes later, and he said, she wants to see what you've written. And I sent it to her. She was here in New York, a woman here in New York named Lisa Drew. She's no longer an editor. She's retired, but she's a wonderful woman. And I met this extraordinary woman named Lillian Burns Sidney. Lillian Burns Sidney was the mentor to Debbie Reynolds. She was about this tall, and she was the acting coach at MGM from 1938 to 1952. She was the woman who decided who would get the star treatment. And she actually was Debbie's mentor, and she actually was the person who who gave me the go-ahead to write this book. So I wrote a book for Debbie Reynolds. This was a very long process because Debbie, whom I loved when I was a kid when she was in the movies, and I actually wasn't that crazy about her at that particular time when I had grown up, and she'd grown up too. But she was a very hardworking woman. She worked 44 weeks a year on the road. Even though she hadn't been in films for a long, long time, she made over $1 million a year since 1963, just really working, a really hardworking girl. And I'd never written a book for anybody, and I didn't know how to do that, obviously. So I interviewed her for hundreds of hours and taped all the interviews and transcribed it and wrote the book. And the book came out. It was very successful. We ended up having a very nice relationship, and it was very interesting for me because she was who she was. I got to interview a lot of people in Hollywood about her who gave me a lot of background. Even I told her how she was born Mary Frances Reynolds, but they changed her name to Debbie Reynolds, and she had no idea why or how that happened. And I learned that obviously from one of the people that I had to interview who worked at Warner Brothers, where she first was in films. So I had kind of succeeded, shall we say, as a writer, and people started asking me to write As Told To books, and I really didn't want to do another one. I met, coincidentally at that time, Kitty Kelly. Kitty Kelly was in Los Angeles researching a book on Frank Sinatra, and she had rented the apartment of a friend of mine, and she had told her, my friend had told Kitty that who I was and what I did, et cetera, and that I knew a lot of Hollywood lore, because actually in the years that I was there, I collected a lot of that stuff as I was curious, and I got around. I was fortunate to be introduced to a lot of people, and I learned a lot, and I was interested in all of it. And Hollywood is an extraordinarily interesting place, probably still today. Anyway, so I told my friend, I have a Frank Sinatra story, which I think she could use. The story was this. Sinatra was very friendly with JFK when he was first in the White House. And Sinatra was going to entertain him and host him at his house in Palm Springs. And at the last minute, the White House decided that Sinatra shouldn't be a host to the President of the United States. So they canceled the stay. And Sinatra was so angry about it that he had a special helipad built in his backyard in Palm Springs so the president could land in his backyard. And when he found out that he wasn't going to be staying at his house, he went out into the backyard with a sledgehammer and tore up the helipad. That was the scandalous story that I gave to Kitty. Now, Kitty and I had a good time talking about all this dish and gossip, et cetera, and she said to me, there's a man in New York who would really like you named Larry Ashmead. Larry Ashmead was a very distinguished editor for Harper and Row. It was going to be called Harper and Row, later HarperCollins. And so I started writing Larry Ashmead the kind of letters I used to write. I'd never met him, but I started writing the kind of letters I used to write Ellis Amburn with all the dish and the dirt about Hollywood, and we became correspondents. And he used to send me a magazine called Quest magazine. And I used to read it, and a lot of mainly the editorial was society stories in New York. And I used to think, I could do this, whatever. And one day, Larry asked me if I would like to write a book on the Cushing sisters here in New York. I don't know if you know who the Cushing sisters were. The Cushing sisters were three very famous sisters from the 1930s to the 1970s. One of them was Babe Paley. One of them was Mrs. Whitney, Betsy Whitney, and the other one was a woman named Minnie Fosberg, who was previously married to Vincent Astor. And so Larry Ashmead detected that I had an eye for this sort of thing and an ear for this sort of thing, and I probably could do it. And he offered me a lot of money. He offered me $100,000 to write this book, which, frankly, being the kind of person I am, that was very intimidating for me, because even though I know I appear to have a great deal of self-confidence, I don't really kid myself about what I can and cannot do. And I will take on things that I can't do, but I'll learn how to do them. But I started writing this book, and actually, this was in 1990, and I came to New York to interview people, and almost nobody would talk to me, partly because of Truman Capote and what he had written about them, although it was fiction, in that article he wrote, and it was published, I think, in Esquire. It was called Coat Bass 1965. Nobody would talk to me. And Mrs. Whitney, Babe Paley had died, and Minnie Fosberg had died, and Mrs. Whitney was the only surviving sister. And Mrs. Whitney, I had been told, was a very, very tough lady in terms of she had her way, whatever that was. And she really didn't want me to write the book. And she went on a campaign, I was very well aware of it, she didn't want anybody to talk to me. They were afraid I would be really mean. So that was very hard, because despite what I do, I'm the kind of person, I never ask you questions that I think you don't want to answer. When I get on to who you are and what you're all about, I think there's something that you don't want me to know, I don't go there. And when you do those kinds of books, you really have to look for stuff. And I did meet some interesting people who did give me interesting information. Although I discovered something then that it still stays with me today. Babe Paley, of course, was very, very famous. And in the late 1960s, I was living in New York. I worked in the Carter Burden campaign when he was running for city council, and he was married to Babe's daughter, Amanda. And all the girls there were all crazy about Babe Paley. They talked about her all the time, so I was really curious to see what this woman looked like, because they said she's extraordinary looking. And one day she came in, and she was a very nice looking lady, but she wore very, very, very heavy pancake makeup. I mean, it looked like she'd just been on stage or something. It was strange, and it was strange to me that this fashion plate would go out in public with this kind of, it wasn't like what you ladies do when you know how to put on makeup to make yourself look nice. She had pancake makeup all over her face. She also looked very sad. There was a sadness to her gait when she walked. She looked very bored. This was in 1969, and of course by 1990 she had died. And so I knew that there was sadness in her life. I didn't succeed in writing this book. I finally actually gave up writing this book because it was impossible to get people to talk to me, and I'm not really aggressive in that. I went back to California with my tail between my legs. Then I got an offer to write a book for Bobby Short. And I knew Bobby. I didn't know him well, but I knew him socially, and I was a great admirer of his talent. And the money for this book was really terrible. It was a quarter of what they offered me for the Cushing book, and actually they had two agents taking 15% each, so it was 30% of the bad money. But I was so broke, I needed the job. And so I took it. And Bobby had written a book before this, a memoir called Black and White Baby, and it was actually a memoir of the first 13 years of his life. Now think about that, a book about the first 13 years of your life from 1 to 13. Well, Bobby Short had an amazing memory. He couldn't read music, and he knew 6,000 songs. He knew all the lyrics and all the melodies and could play them. He was an amazing, amazing talent. And so in this book, Black and White Baby, he remembered everything that happened to him from the time that he had a memory as a child. And he had an extraordinary experience because he was a young black kid in the age of Jim Crow who was out there in America and having to put up with all the stuff they had to put up with as a child. And it was extremely, extremely difficult. So the one thing that troubled me about it was I could see that unlike Debbie Reynolds, who's willing to share with me an enormous amount of intimate information, even though a lot of it she probably guarded, because we all do that, I could see from Bobby's first book that he didn't give you any emotional information about himself. And you know, it's very hard to write about a character if the emotions aren't there. So I took the job because I needed the money, and I really admired him and really liked him. And as I was driving across America from Los Angeles to New York with my 3 dogs and my computer, I knew that if it didn't work out, I was going to be stuck in New York, which made me very unhappy because I really liked living in Los Angeles. I was so unhappy about it that, I know this sounds nuts, but when in St. Louis, I was so depressed about my situation because I thought if it doesn't work out, I'm going to be stuck in New York. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm going to have to work in New York, and I still don't have a lot of confidence as a writer, and I thought, who the hell is going to hire me? So I did something I've done a few times in my life. I took my mind off of that reality, and I thought, well, if you have to earn a living in New York as a writer, David, what would you like to do? What would make you happy? And I thought to myself, I would like to write a social column in New York. Now, that probably sounds a little nuts, but when I was growing up, my father, the New Yorker, always got the tabloids every day. I used to have to get on my bike and go to the newspaper store and pick up the Daily News and the Daily Mirror, and at a very young age, I started reading all the columns. In fact, every Sunday night, Walter Winchell broadcast at 9 o'clock at night on the radio, you know, good evening, Mr. and Mrs. North and South America, all the ships at sea, let's go to press. And I read Susie, I read Aileen Maley, and I had this ongoing collection of information about that world, and I thought, well, I'd like to do that if I could do anything. But again, I didn't know how I'd do anything about it. I got to New York, started working with Bobby, and I don't know if you knew him, but he was a real gentleman in every way, and he was extraordinarily talented. But he would tell me some stories about what happened to him as a child when he was traveling the country and working, and the way he was treated. And they were terrible stories because he wasn't physically abused, but he had a very abusive experience. And when I would ask him, how did that feel? His answer was always the same. How do you think it would feel? Well, I knew how it would feel for me, but I didn't know how it would feel for him. And he really was not willing to give me that. The way he handled his life and the way he got through his life was he just didn't go there. He just kept moving forward. And it became very, very difficult to pull something out. I was thinking this is a story that every young person of color could use as an inspiration to go out into the world in life if they could hear what this guy did and how he did it, because he did it. He even became a member of the New York Social Register. And he was very popular, but he didn't want to do that. And one day, I was sitting in my friend, again, Beth DeWoody's house out in Southampton, trying to write this manuscript. And I said, how the fuck am I going to do this? And the phone rang. Right after I said that out loud to God, the phone rang, and it was my agent. He said, I have bad news. I said, what's that? He said, Bobby wants to end the collaboration. I said, actually, that's good news because I didn't know how I would do it. And so I understood why he did. It was awkward for him because we had a very nice relationship, but we ended up being friends anyway. At the same time, coincidentally, the same friend of mine who I stayed with in her house in New York and in Southampton, one night took me to a cocktail party at Chanel, and I met the woman who owned Quest magazine. Her name was Heather Cohane. She was about this tall, and she was an English lady. She was a rather eccentric lady. And I told her I'd read her magazine many times in Los Angeles. She had actually read something I had written in Connoisseur magazine about some people in Los Angeles. And I told her we had a mutual friend, a woman in Philadelphia named Gloria Edding. And she said she'd always wanted an article written about her, and would I like to do that? And I said, yes, of course. And I wrote an article about this woman. And after that, from then on, that was 1992, from then on, I wrote every month for Quest magazine, I wrote a social profile of, and what I had learned from working on the Cushing book, and what I had learned from Bobby Short, and what I had learned from all these other experiences I had, I could write with some authority on these people. And so I did. Every month, sometimes I wrote 2 articles. And actually, we started, one month I had nothing to write, and I had no time to write it, and I needed the money to pay the rent, and I had nothing. So I said to Heather, why don't we have a new 400 list? And at that time, nobody knew what the 400 was anymore. I mean, there were people in this room probably who did, but a lot of people didn't know. So we started a 400 list. And the way we started the list was we got out all the party pictures of people that we had in the files of Quest magazine. If there were two of her and 3 of her and 3 of her, they went on the list. If there were none of you, you weren't on the list, unless you were a well-known person, and that's how we put you on the list. The list became very, very popular, and actually people took it really seriously, which really surprised me because it was just a made-up list. And in 1993, Heather said to me, why don't you write a column? And I thought, yes, I will. And I did. And I started writing the Social Diary, and that's actually how it started. Then I left Heather and eventually became editor of Avenue magazine when it was owned by a woman named Judy Price. And all that time, when I started writing the column, Liz Smith, who's one of the most generous people in New York, I had got to know her. She went around to all the papers. She went to Rupert Murdoch, she went to Mr. Sulzberger, and she went to, what's the other paper now? It's gone out of my head. There was one other paper she went to, the Daily News. She went to Mr. Zuckerman and asked them if they would hire me to write a social column. And they all said, no, nobody's interested in that. Now, I knew people were interested in it because I, as a little boy growing up in Massachusetts, was really interested in it, and I knew a lot of other people were too. So I thought, this is terrible, but I mean, that's the way it is. But the internet had come along, and I knew then, in the early 90s, that the internet was going to be a place for me to go to have a diary, because there were people everywhere, maybe not lots of them, but there were a lot of people everywhere who would want to read it, and so everywhere I went, people said to me, oh, you need $1 million in a business plan to start a website. And I thought, well, nobody's going to give me $1 million for this, and I don't know how to write a business plan. So this went on and on and on. And finally, I was working, as I said, for Mrs. Price. And one night I had dinner with her and her husband at Swifty's restaurant. And this was in June of 2000. And she said, I'm almost finished, incidentally. She said, we're going to have a website. And I thought, oh, great. She's going to have a website. I'm going to do it. And I went home that night, and I was so depressed, I thought to myself, if you're going to do it, David, you're going to have to do it, and you're going to have to do it now, and that's that. So I thought to myself how much money I had in the bank And I still didn't know what I was doing, but I figured out how much money I had in the bank, so how long could I live without earning any money? And I think it was about a year. And the next day, so I decided I was going to leave Avenue Magazine in August of 2000 and start a website. And the next day, I went into the office, and I had an assistant. His name is Jeff Hirsch, is that guy over there. And he's this young guy, and he was a very able assistant. He always did everything he needed to do. He and I have never worked together in the same room, because when he started working for me as my assistant, I stopped working in the office. I worked only at home, which Mrs. Price found very difficult to take, but she took it anyway. And so I went into the office, and I said to him, I'm going to quit on August 15th. And I put that day on the 15th because you got paid on the first and the middle of the month, on the 15th of the month, and the check was put into your bank account. And I didn't want her to know I was leaving, because I knew if I told her in advance, there was a possibility the check wouldn't be in my bank account. So I went in and I told Jeff, I said, I'm going to start a website. I'm going to leave and I start a website. And I said, actually, this is the smartest move I ever made. I said, actually, if you'd like, you could join me and start a website with me. And he, being this young guy, said, yeah, sure, it's the internet. And he did. And on August 15th, 2000, we both left. We both went in and told Mrs. Price we were leaving separately. And we started this website called the New York Social Diary. And actually, this September is our 12th year with the New York Social Diary. And we are read all over the world. I know that we're read in the White House. I know that we're even read in Buckingham Palace. And we are read in Hollywood. I still write a lot about Hollywood. And that's how I became a writer. And that's the story. Now, do we have time for questions, or are you ending it?
You were very generous with your time. We can take a few questions,
Okay,
but not too long.
All right.
But I thought that was a fabulous talk.
Oh, thank you.
So let's take a few.
Anybody got a question, or you just want to get the hell out of here?
Young
Okay.
lady here.
Well, my name's Alice O'Grady, and I'm a writer, I think. But my question is, have you written a biography yet?
Have I written a biography? You mean my biography? No, I haven't.
Memoir.
Well, I can't. That's why.
We'll give you the transcript from this tonight.
No, because it's what?
Too many skeletons.
It's very intimidating for me. You know, the thing about it is, I'm 70 years old, and I have, quote unquote, from looking out, from outside looking in, I have succeeded at my, quote unquote, goal, my objective. But my confidence as a writer, although I have confidence, I never thought I had any discipline as a writer until I started writing on the internet. And the reason I developed discipline was because I had to produce something every day, and I just had to do it. So I had no time to worry about it or think about it. I just had to do it. Now, when you ask me to write a book, it's like, oh God, you know, it's an awesome task. I don't want anybody to write my book. Oh, he couldn't write it, actually. He probably could. He's a good writer, but he doesn't write. He's the guy who designs the website. He's the guy that makes everything look good. He's the guy who tells me when I've gone too far. He's the guy who tells me to cool it, shut up, that other stuff. You know, he doesn't show me any respect anymore, because now, even though I'm a lot older than he is, we're peers.
Take two more questions.
Okay.
How big is your staff for the Social Diary?
The staff is me and this guy here, yeah. And then we have a lot of contributors now. We have about 18 or 20 contributors.
How do you make money?
Advertisers. And our advertising director is sitting over there in the red sweater. And actually, we got her because I met her one day. I had taken a picture of her son. You know, the whole thing about the internet and the web is this. You know, this is, wherever I go, whenever anybody sees me, all they want is to have their picture taken. And actually, there's a phenomenon going on now in the internet that's begun in the last year, and that's people asking us to take their pictures off of the internet. And they have a whole lot of reasons for doing it, and a lot of times the reasons are basically they don't like the picture. But they give you a lot of excuses. They say, I'm not married to that person anymore, I don't go out with that person anymore, or they even say, I've had a little work done and I don't look like that. Or they say they're having thief. What was that? Okay.
Are those pictures sometimes retouched by the photographer?
There is one photographer who does retouch the pictures. I will not tell you that photographer's name. I don't really like that idea, but actually, no. Almost all of the pictures are, there's a woman here in this room who also takes pictures, as you may know, Mrs. Crements, and she actually does not retouch her pictures, I don't think. No. But I don't really like retouched pictures. I think it's nice if we look the way we look. We, as a habit, do not publish pictures of people if they don't look good or if they look funny. Except for me, I think I look very funny.
Let's take one more.
Okay, one more question. Okay.
Your talk was fabulous. I read your column every day on the internet. I love it.
Thank you.
If, in a brief way, your career has been so fascinating. What, if anything, would you do differently if you were starting over?
What would David do differently if he was starting over?
I don't think anything, because I'm just me, and this is how I am. I don't like a lot of it a lot of the time, but I've been very fortunate, and actually, you probably could tell in the story, I've been very fortunate in all my life, from the time I was a young boy. It gets to me. There have always been people who have been very, very good to me, and very generous and very nice to me. And that is everything. And that's just a blessing. So in terms of doing something differently, I have a lot of bad habits. I feel like I don't have discipline. I certainly don't know everything. I used to think I knew everything. Now I think I know nothing. So it's the way it is. And actually, there have been a lot of really wonderful people in my life, and there still are. Okay? Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for listening all this time.
That was a wonderful, wonderful talk. Thank goodness we've recorded it, and I agree with the lady who wants you to turn it into a memoir. Thank you all for coming, and we hope you come to other events.